Don't you love it when things are both easier and more affordable? Like when the rain washes your car for you. Or like when you save up to 10% by bundling your renters and auto insurance with USAA. Bundle with USAA and start saving. Get a quote today.
You are tuned in to the Foul Weather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
How does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Canadian Wildlife Service track waterfowl harvest? How do they track the number of waterfowl hunters and their harvest? Today on the Foul Weather Podcast, we cut through the BS to report the facts about how we keep track of duck harvest and hunter metrics. In response to a massive amount of misinformation coming across your wavelengths, the Foul Weather Podcast embarked on the 2025 DataStream series. It can be attractive to find conspiracies that help explain what you observe as a duck hunter. Or maybe you even thought up some fake news yourself that was fun. The reality is that the long history of data used in waterfowl conservation and management in North America is a success story that deserves everyone's attention. Bumps and bruises we have, but dedicated we are as the duck people across duck country USA, dedicated to the long-term health of ducks and duck hunting. This series dives deep into how the surveys, banding, and harvest surveys and models work. Join us to learn more and share this great information with all the great people across duck country USA. Remember that this last season you knew where the ducks were at before the ducks knew where they were at. We're very thankful for our every week listeners. You folks know who you are. Those that never miss a single migration forecast episode each Monday morning. Y'all are as ate up as me about ducks, duck biology, and duck migration. Our dedicated weekly listeners can pick the best days to hunt because the Foul Weather Podcast forecasts fresh ducks hot from the north. You know where the ducks are at before the ducks know where they're at, right? Shoot the ducks from the north before they know where they're at. Also, just a reminder as well to take a minute to rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. We appreciate your support very, very much. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, coming to you from the home office in Jack's Reef. We haven't had a Jaeger update in a few months, and some of our listeners asked about her health once again. For our loyal listeners, you know that baby Jaeger, our 48-pound pocket lab, well, she has a mysterious liver disease that we've been working on for some time. The good news is that she remains asymptomatic and is spending her days on the farm following the tractor around, hiking with me while we scout for turkeys, and getting daily swims in our seasonal pond before it dries up for the season. But for those not aware, we got a senior blood panel done for Jaeger a few years back, and she had elevated ALT values, which is indicative of liver damage. Long story short as possible here, through her liver biopsy, we detected that she had copper storage disease, which is increasingly common in yellow lab females and often shows up at age 5 or 6. Most dogs can process copper and it never gets toxic into the toxic values range, but Jaeger has this disease where she's not able to purge her body of copper and had a toxic load of copper in her liver that would have killed her if we did not treat it. We put her on chelation meds. This is similar to like the lead chelation process in bald eagles to help them recover. So we put her on chelation meds and it kind of scrubbed the copper from her blood. And for a bit, her ALT values declined. It gets never really into the safe level, but then they just started again to continue to climb. So we have her on chelated copper-free food, so it isn't like she got into copper in her food again. And recently, and kind of new news for our listenership, is that we have her on autoimmune suppressants because it's possible that her body is attacking her own liver for some reason. And her ALT values last month dropped to the lowest we've seen yet. We'll have her back at the vet in another month for another test to see if we finally maybe have this under control. We don't know how all these things interacted with each other, but the story is she probably wouldn't be with us right now without our intervention. So, you know, if you got an older dog, do some blood work, get a senior blood panel just to make sure, you know, everything's okay. Right now, she's snoozing on the porch in the warm spring sun and loving life. Soon enough, we hope to have more turkey hunting stories for y'all, but you know, like I do, that turkey populations are down in a lot of places across this country, and we are working our butts off to even find birds again this year. I just heard my first gobbling turkey in New York the other day and found a ton of strutters driving around, of course, mostly on private ground, not on public. But this should be a reminder about how different our seasons are from north to south across this great continent, with gobbling activity waning in the south and just getting going to a reasonable amount in the north. We also want to report that the prairies are still dry, and the southern prairies are very dry. So don't expect a huge resurgence in duck populations this year. We are likely at or near the bottom. We also have river gauges in the south, southern Illinois, Missouri, and northeast Arkansas at flood stage, with more water still coming down the Mississippi. All of this is playing havoc with already stressed trees from drought last year and flood that kind of goes in a quick cycle back and forth, and moist soil areas that are currently inundated. We hope we dry out soon in those areas and send some much needed rain into the prairies at just the right time this summer. So, up next, how does the Harvest Information Program and Parts Collection Survey work? So please stick with us. Beckman Game Calls has it dialed in. If you want a duck call that is adjustable to your air pressure and sounds like a duck, this is it. I've blown a ton of different calls in my life, but this one is the real deal. Look, we don't endorse just anything. We are only going to put forward a call that works. The Edison by Chris Beckman of Beckman Game Calls? Yeah, this beauty sounds like a duck. I only know of one published research paper focused on what makes a duck call sound like a duck. Go look me up, and you will see that colleagues and I have the only paper published in scientific literature about what makes a duck call sound like a duck. For sure, Chris Beckman did his homework, and this call sounds like a duck. This guy knows how to make a duck call, period. But don't just take my word for it. Here's the proof. First, a hen recording, and then the Edison in the big woods of Arkansas. Visit them today at BeckmanGameCalls.com. All right, into the meat and potatoes of today. You've probably heard that all the data from the Harvest Information Program must be wrong, but that is not nearly close to the truth. Again, just like the BPOP episode, attacking the Harvest Information Program data is wrong is a misguided approach. Rather, we should be asking, are these data good enough for decision making, and how is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Office looking to increase the efficiency and accuracy of these data? That is the right discussion. Not tearing down our good people working for the ducks, but finding ways to lift them up and help them get the job done better. Technically, the Harvest Information Program, or HIP, and Parts Collection Survey, or PCS, are separate, but one does inform the other. The intent of HIP and PCS is to provide migratory bird harvest and hunter activity that is part of the decision-making process used to set hunting season dates, hunting zones, and bag limits. The big picture is that this is information that is critical to ensuring that harvest is sustainable and within the bounds of what the current population can take regarding harvest. I would say that the HIP and PCS are probably even more misunderstood than the BPOP. If you haven't heard our full rundown of how the waterfowl breeding, population, and habitat survey works, go back to episode 82, Is the BPOP Wrong? There are really three components here. Every duck hunter has to register for the Harvest Information Program, and you get a HIP number that you have to keep with you while hunting. I write mine on the back of my duck stamp. Why is registering for HIP important beyond that it is law? When we tried to track waterfowl hunter numbers prior to 1999 when HIP started, we previously used duck stamp sales. The problem is that many people collecting duck stamps that don't hunt are out there. And because we also know that duck stamp purchases are important for conservation, for wetlands, through the National Wildlife Refuge System and private land easements, many people like me buy more than one in support of those efforts. In our own house, between my wife and I, we are up to buying 4 duck stamps each year now to support that effort. So you can't reliably understand how many waterfowl hunters there are by just using duck stamp sales. Also, simply through duck stamp sales, we have no idea what type of hunter you are. Do you hunt just ducks, or ducks and geese, or ducks, geese, swans, rails, and woodcock? A major point of confusion for hunters is that they think the questions asked during the HIP registration is how we calculate harvest, and that is not true. All those questions do is enable the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a pool of people to survey more intensely. For instance, I'm likely one of the few people that hunts rails in New York, so I'm likely to get a survey very often because they only survey a percentage of the people that hunt rails. Similarly, for waterfowl, the aim is to survey about 5% of the hunters, but that varies by state based on how many people waterfowl hunt in that state. So we come up with, in the end, a survey of about 5% of all hunters that go into the hunter diaries, where people tell the Fish and Wildlife Service how many days they hunted, where they hunted, and how many birds they harvested. Now, there are several tiers of hunters that are surveyed, and typically you have to state that you are at least a duck hunter, or you hunted last year by harvesting at least a duck to get surveyed. Then there are other tiers of hunters that harvested moderate and large numbers of waterfowl. Not going into the weeds, but from those groups, likelihood of selection is stratified so that we get a sample of hunters that harvest a few birds, and then also a sample of hunters that harvested a lot of birds. This generates a random stratified list of a bunch of hunters that would have traditionally gotten a paper survey for the hunter diary that asked them to write down the days they hunt, what town and state they hunted in, and how many birds and of what type they bagged on that day. The hunter is not asked to put down the species that they harvested because, okay, let's face it, duck hunters across the board are not waterfowl professionals, and simply there would be errors in species identification. You've seen it all from your time with your buddies in the blind, some folks not knowing what they shot. We hope most folks can tell, but it's not always easy. So traditionally, there would have been a bunch of mailings to ensure that when selected, that you actually sent in your results. But to increase the government efficiency, definitely buzzwords nowadays, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service worked to get this information online a few years back so that you could enter your data throughout the year. That was the first change to the harvest information program of that large extent in many, many years. So now it is an online system that gives you reminders through email. For instance, I had actually filled out my information for my rail harvest, but because I only go for the first few weeks of September, I had forgotten to actually submit my final harvest numbers. So I was prompted by email to finalize my information, which I did. Another change that happened was that previously, if someone signed up for HIP but noted that they had not shot a duck in the last year, they were not sent a survey. But now that bottom tier has been surveyed more, and interestingly, the number of ducks bagged increased fairly substantially. So what folks are working on now is trying to determine if that bottom tier, potentially making up of folks that go 1 year, then not the next, but again a few years later, maybe they make up a good amount of harvest just by the sheer number of people in this kind of churn category. Waterfowl professionals talk a lot about churn, those hunters that come and go from ducks among years. So why did the Fish and Wildlife Service change the number of people they surveyed? They could. That's basically it. Because they no longer had the financial and logistical burden of direct mailings to your house and could survey more hunters. So they added that lower tier because they could. In my opinion, good for them to look to expand the survey more people, but did it change the incoming data, and folks are working on it and trying to explain that change? Yeah, that definitely happened. Okay, so that is the hunter diaries of when you hunted, where you hunted, and how many birds you shot. And again, we're surveying about 5% of the waterfowl population to get that. Now, with some weighting factors, we can use that number and multiply it by the total number of people that said that they duck hunted. That gets you to the total duck harvest. But then how do we know what species got harvested? The hunter diaries also give us how many days people hunted so we can derive ducks per hunter day. so that we have some understanding about how effort influences changes in harvest. Specifically, think about this. With declining numbers of waterfowl hunters, we can't just look at how harvest has changed. We must divide it by the number of days that hunters have gone so we can understand how ducks harvested per unit effort has or has not changed through time. So understanding now species, sex, and age of ducks harvested in that overall harvest is where the Parts Collection Survey, or PCS, comes in. Another subsample of hunters are asked to send a wing in by mail, or from ducks, or for goose hunters, they are asked to send in the outer primaries and tail feathers. All of these go into a giant walk-in cooler in a specified location in each flyway. Here in the Atlantic Flyway, they go to the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. In fact, a grad student and I were just there a few weeks back to collect samples for a study funded by Delta Waterfowl aimed at understanding where our green-winged teal, widgeon, and gadwall originate in the Atlantic Flyway, so we can ensure we're sending funding to the right place to conserve the breeding grounds for these ducks and sustain ducks over people's blinds in the Atlantic Flyway. Sorry, a little deviation from the point at hand here. So for a week-long period after the season, when all the duck and goose parts have been mailed in, pilot biologists, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologists at those USGS centers, state biologists, aspiring waterfowl professionals, that is students, as well as academics like myself, get together for what is called the wing bee, right? Haha, it's like a spelling bee, but with duck wings and goose parts. We all get together and sex and age the ducks. We can actually tell from every single wing of a duck, you can tell the sex of that bird as well as the age. Throughout the year, the wings are gone through as they come into each one of these centers, and they're designated by species and put into their designated boxes one by one, and then each day we would show up with all these folks in the room and go box by box through those, having them already identified by species, but getting the sex and age, right? Before you start into any of these boxes, and for like mallards, there's 50, 60 boxes of wings, right? Before all that happens, each table has a checker who sits at the end of the table and ensures the folks identifying what sex and age the bird is, and they go through exactly all the characteristics you should be looking for to designate that as sex and age. And then once you do sit down at the table, the checker checks every single envelope, every single wing that's identified, and agrees or disagrees, and sometimes changes that categorization if needed, to make sure that that designation is correct. Well, what makes one a checker? You actually have to take a test from a drawer of about 100 known sex and age wings by species, right? So you can be only a checker for certain species, or you can be a checker for all species, and you have to pass this test. You get 3 chances to get it right, and the test actually gets harder as you go. That is, and I'm not 100% certain on these percentages, it's kind of like a guess. But it's like you have to get 90% of the wings right on the first try. If you don't do that, the second try you have to get 97% of them right. And the last try is like 99% correct, right? If you don't pass, you don't get to be a checker. So here we go again. We must understand that what we do as waterfowl professionals is not taken lightly. This is serious business, and it takes very rigorous professional training and testing. So from this information, we get the species, sex, and age composition of the harvest. This allows us to multiply that percentage of species in the harvest by the total numbers of ducks to understand on a state-by-state basis how many mallards we shoot, how many gadwall we shoot, how many canvasback we shoot. And it also gives us the sex and age ratios of the harvest. Now, this is getting a bit into the how we use banding data episode that I'm going to do later on, but understand that there is a difference in vulnerability to harvest by sex and age. We call that differential vulnerability, and it can be determined through banding data. For instance, if you put out 100 bands on a bunch of adult male mallards, adult female mallards, juvenile male mallards, and juvenile female mallards, and the return rates of those bands is exactly the same, then there is no differential vulnerability. but we tend to target drakes. So we have to correct the sex and age of the harvest for this differential vulnerability. And some of that's not just vulnerability, it's like literally like how we choose to harvest birds, right? From this information, we understand that when the prairies go dry, we see reduced juveniles in the harvest. Productivity has declined. We also use this information to see that male to female sex ratios have changed, indicating that female mallards are likely having a harder time surviving the breeding season, and this indicates that we likely have a habitat problem on the breeding grounds. Ooh, that's a lot. So I do hope you got it all digested. Up next, we review some of the burn it all down stuff from that episode and put in a bit more effort on making the bee pop make sense. So please stick with us. Hold on, folks. Don't turn that channel. We've got some really exciting news for you. The Foul Weather Podcast has teamed up with Wildlife Strategies. That's right. I'm now working directly with Ryan Delaney of Wildlife Strategies to build value into your land. Wildlife Strategies is already known for quality wildlife habitat management, be it deer, turkeys, ducks, or whatever you pursue. Ryan knows his stuff. Look, I don't add my name to just any business, but I believe in what Wildlife Strategies is doing for landowners throughout the Southeast U.S. and beyond. If you want science-based solutions to create great wildlife habitat, Wildlife Strategies is your best bet. If you're interested in ducks, when we say, may your skies be filled, well, Wildlife Strategies does just that. They fill your skies with ducks. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You won't be disappointed you did. Ryan covers the southern tier of states, and I'm available to build habitat management plans across the northern tier. Contact us today for a quote. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year time frame management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Contact Ryan today at ryan@farmlg.com or Dr. Mike at foulweather.co. You won't be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks and your forests and fields with deer and turkey with Wildlife Strategies. All right, I'm full up for this summer throughout our northern tier state, so no more room right now for any more contracts for me. But if you have interest in having more ducks and more bucks and just more quality wildlife and human habitat on your property, give me a shout at Dr. Mike at foulweather.co to schedule an appointment for next year. And as always, feel free to reach out to Ryan Delaney of Wildlife Strategies for your Mid-South needs. Hey, a shout out to Ramsey Russell on the Duck Season Somewhere podcast. I just did a 2-part series with him, episodes 574 and 576, Chicken Little, Debunking Waterfowl Myths, Part 1 and Part 2. And wow, the Foul Weather podcast right now can't imagine having episodes approaching 600 in number. So kudos to you, Ramsey, for keeping it going. Also, go listen to Ramsey's special bonus episode with Brad Bortner, Dr. Jim Sedinger, and Dr. Rick Kaminsky about keeping the waterfowl world solvent and functional. Kudos to Ramsey for speaking the truth. Next, I want to put a shout out to Forrest Carvajal and his Off the X podcast. When we put out a call to action on the Burn It Down episode to come to us if you have questions, don't just go put out misinformation is what we said. If you are wondering how the waterfowl works, ask me. Ask the Foul Weather podcast. We have no agenda other than ensuring that people understand how the waterfowl world works. So Forrest reached out and worked to ensure the information they were BSing about was correct. The Off the X podcast is a great look at public hunting for a bunch of fun dudes BSing about ducks and duck hunting. Recommend you go check them out. And look, I don't see these folks as competition. Instead, these folks complement what we do. For sure, the Foul Weather podcast is always going to be a science-based podcast that distills the hard-to-understand information down to all the great people across Duck Country, USA. Hey, and guess what? Sometimes we move too fast and have been told that exactly by listeners. And here's a perfect example. When we went through the BPOP, we described how we count ducks to add them up to get a population estimate. And it may not have been entirely clear. So here we go one more time and in a different tone. Right. When we see a pair of ducks, when we're flying over the prairies, flying over the boreal, when we see a pair of ducks, a male and a female, that is counted, obviously, as 2 ducks. When we see a lone male, that is considered an indicated breeding pair, or again, considered as 2 ducks. That is, males stay on territories, on ponds, while hens are off laying an egg. We know that's a thing, so we can't just call that male 1 duck. We also count up to 4 male ducks as indicated pairs, and then we multiply that by 2. So if we see 3 male ducks together, we call that 6, because very often, and maybe even increasingly so with wetland consolidation and fewer wetlands, these males have females they are paired with, but those hens are off nesting and laying eggs. Any male group greater than 4 is counted as individuals because these are more likely just a bachelor group of males. There's more males in the population. We know that. Mixed groups, like 3 or more of a mixed sex grouping of the same species in close association, which cannot be separated into singles and pairs, these are counted as the numbers of birds observed, period. And then anything over 45 birds, they're not even counted because this is considered, that they're still migrating, and we don't want to put those birds on that area and say that location on the prairies or the boreal is where those birds are nesting. Sure, all of this has error, just like HIP and the Parts Collection Survey. But is it good enough for decision making? And is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service consistently trying to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of their work? Yeah, 100% of the time. A major criticism of the Harvest Information Program is that some places selling licenses just hit 0 for every question about harvest when someone signs up for HIP to get through the answers and just sell a license. Okay, get it. And everyone has acknowledged this issue, and it is largely a state issue whereby the states need to do a better job of aligning with the Harvest Information Program. And many states have reacted to this, but the reality is that states need to get on board with helping us track duck hunter numbers as well. Parts of HIP and PCS are robust to these issues, but others are not. We definitely had no idea how many duck hunters using duck stamp sales. We did not know how many duck hunters there were by using duck stamp sales. Now we have a new way of doing business that is increasingly defensible from attack. Can it use refinement? Heck yeah. Is it wrong enough to negate all the great information gathered? Hardly. All right, let's just stop there with that. Last, people attack the harvest across the border in Canada, that there is no way they can know how many ducks we harvested because U.S. citizens go and shoot so many ducks. Okay, here's the deal. The methods are very similar in Canada as the U.S., and in fact, some of them are likely even more advanced statistically. We've covered this topic before on the Foul Weather podcast, but do this for me. Go into Google and type in Scholar, Scholar. It's Google, and then click on Google Scholar and search Duck Harvest Canada Smith. And Smith is the name of the first author. And you will find an article titled, should be right at the top, Hierarchical Bayesian Integrated Model for Estimating Migratory Bird Harvest in Canada. It's published in the Journal of Wildlife Management. If you can't see it because it's behind a paywall, there's a little button under it that says all 9 versions, and then look down and find the link that says pdfarchive.org, and it should give you the whole article. Anyhow, the point is that this is some high-tech stuff and does well to track harvest. The one nuance, because U.S. citizens can't just mail wings across the border into Canada, is that the composition of the harvest, species, sex, and age, is assumed to be the same by U.S. hunters and Canadians. Yeah, of course, some error, but probably pretty damn similar on a provincial basis scale. All right, hopefully we've educated you on how HIP, Harvest Information Program, and PCS, the Parts Collection Survey, work. Keep track of us all summer while we run also the Foul Weather Podcast Young Waterfowl Professional Series, where we meet and interview the next generation of waterfowl and wetlands conservation and leaders. Whew, they are our future. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.